Welcome to Aleatory Encounters, a Steiner Books podcast. What you are about to listen to is an audio snapshot of an in-person human conversation that took place here at our offices in Spencertown, New York. In this episode with Daniel Polikoff. Daniel Polikoff, how was COVID for you?
COVID was a very dark time. The Pacifica Graduate Institute is where I was teaching Rilke and the poetic basis of mind, which is kind of where I come from, literature, psychology, philosophy. And late June of 21, which is already a good year into the pandemic, the writing was somewhat on the wall that Pacifica might well consider imposing vaccine mandates. By that time, I had been awakened through my wife, Monica, to all the deep uncertainties about the mainstream story. As everyone knows, when COVID first manifested, the fear was tremendous. Drastic measures were taken almost overnight. Our son was a freshman in Boulder, and 1 week the school said, well, classes are going on as normal, and overnight they changed their tune and he was driving home through a snowstorm over the Sierra. Campus emptied out overnight, so lives were drastically altered in no time flat. And a lot of one's normal activities were curtailed, obviously, and this cloak of fear had been dropped upon the world. And I was one of those who felt that that was a web of illusion and that there was not a need for the kind of measures that were being taken, that the danger from the disease was drastically exaggerated. I saw very clearly that people who were dissenting from the mainstream view and from the narrative of fear and panic were being summarily silenced, so that there was no real debate, no real objectivity about how COVID originated, the danger it posed, the efficacy of the measures, and so forth. And most of all, I was fairly convinced that there was no way that I was going to take this experimental vaccine, because I had absolutely no confidence that it was a safe measure. And so I began a letter to Joe Cambry, the president of Pacifica, discouraging him from imposing vaccine mandates and mask mandates and the whole 9 yards, to trying to preempt being closed out of teaching at Pacifica. Of course, that ultimately was a vain effort. I did lose my job for a number of years, although just now I've finally, after 4 or 5 years, been reinstated. I get to teach my poetic basis of mind, my Rilke course again. So in writing the letter, I thought I was just going to write, a normal letter, a page and a half or so, expressing my feelings about this. Of course, when I started writing, I had trouble stopping. And it soon became obvious as the letter went to 15 pages, to 30 pages. And I just wanted to touch a few essential bases of the picture as I saw it. The suppression of any kind of objective discussion or public debate, which I felt was utterly wrong and contrary to democratic principles, and how, given that suppression of any dissent, there was no way of objectively knowing what was safe or not safe. And I didn't think that an Institute of Liberal Education should swallow the mainline story just because certain public health authorities had issued certain edicts. Because that time as well, I was very aware of all the lines of influence that were feeding into those measures. the enormous influence of big pharma and how our public health agencies had essentially been captured, and how there were early treatment was being utterly sabotaged. There were effective early treatments available, which would have been the intelligent way to go, but that the official policy was hell-bent on enforcing a universal vaccination. So, I wanted to touch those bases, talk about what I saw going on, the suppression of early treatment, the suppression of free speech, and the authorization of measures in the name of science that was anything but, because science welcomes disagreement, dissent, and requires actual empirical testing, not just fudging of numbers, which was a lot of what was going on. So the letter that I was going to write to him turned into 75 pages, and that was part one, and then it turned into just continuing to write. And I ultimately wrote an actual page-and-a-half letter to him.
Were you surprised that this was happening in this way?
Surprised? Well, I was certainly taken aback. I've been working and living as a poet, a Rilke scholar, a literary scholar, someone interested in psychology, spiritual matters, the soul. I was, thought I lived in a more or less democratic country. I knew there were, of course, tremendous issues with the government dating back to my childhood in Vietnam. I mean, I wasn't entirely naive, but I would say that in many ways I was deeply naive still as to the depth of corruption that is endemic in government, and that the whole world could march lockstep to draconian measures which violated the freedoms of individuals, violated the Constitution in so many ways, and do so without putting up much resistance. This was shocking. COVID was a shocking and traumatic experience, I think, for people in whatever you believed about the measures or not. I mean, it wrought havoc with society, with people's lives, economically, psychologically, every which way. And of course, that's generational damage. So this became a course then in Daniel Joseph Polikoff learning a little bit about power. One of the facts that became clear is what emerged in my research as a system of global control. And I had not been aware by any means of the extent of what one could call this nascent or not so nascent technocracy that seems to be seizing the reins of power in a quite drastic way. And as one looks into it, one sees that there had been preparation for this Event 201. There was the simulation, which is a favorite tool of military planners and so forth to prepare for events. And you read in the script, and you can look at it on the website, I think, still, of the World Economic Forum, which I think was one of the sponsors, along with John Hopkins and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One becomes familiar with these players who are part of, this vortex of power, of which I had no idea. The script that was dramatized at that Event 201 was the script that then played out almost to the T in the world during the pandemic. There was, for example, in Event 201, a great deal of talk about misinformation and how to counter that, which was a word I'd never heard of, So all the strategies that we saw rolled out to try and enforce a kind of hegemonic understanding of reality were put in play. So yes, I was very taken aback by this coup that was exercised upon the world, and began to understand a bit of the mechanism, which is tremendously complex and no one understands completely, but I got a little window. I like to talk about the Matrix in kind of allusion to the Wachowski brothers' iconic film. Yeah, the machinations of power and the technocratic agenda. This was something that was not on my radar at all, really. You know, your kids all of a sudden have cell phones, so the incursion of a certain kind of technology into our lives is evident. But how it became synced to an ideology, and in a way that was orchestrated with such practical effect on such a global scale. Who had a clue?
I wonder how your experience of what was happening in the world in 2020 and 2021 jibed with your colleagues in the university.
Well, that was certainly one of the most painful parts. First of all, I will mention, said who had a clue? Well, obviously people in the recent past and even the distant past have had a clue about this kind of thing emerging. I mean, it's the classic motif of a great deal of dystopian science fiction, but Brave New World, Orwell, I mean, these are auguries of what transpired. So there have been visionaries who have seen the possibility for this kind of thing to unfold.
Because it was living in the world then, and it never went away.
Yeah. And has perhaps been gathering power and means kind of in the shadows. Now, as far as my colleagues and so forth, I live in the Bay Area. This is a liberal stronghold. The educational institutions I've been associated with, or academic, quasi-academic institutions, Pacifica, which I teach in a Jungian and an archetypal depth psychology program, the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I have taught, the Jung Institute of San Francisco, where I've given many, many talks. Without an exception, all of these institutions swallowed the mainstream COVID story hook, line, and sinker. And there was no sympathy whatsoever, no interest in engaging questions about it. I had given money to the San Francisco Jung Institute, not a great deal of money, but they are building a new building down on Mission Street, which now is up and operating. I couldn't even go in that building. I couldn't even go in CIIS where I had taught. So I was systematically excluded from most of the enclaves.
You couldn't enter because of
vaccine mandates. You had to be vaccinated, and you had to show your vaccination identification to get into the building. Couldn't go to restaurants, and you were essentially closed out of society. Of course, to a certain degree, everyone was for a certain while, but then there came a certain point when the vaccines were rolled out, is if you had your vaccination identification, you could go to restaurants, you could go to the gym, but if you were unvaccinated, oh no. It was an experience of very novel experience in that way, and gave me an appreciation for the practical and psychological force of discrimination, because I was all of a sudden part of a minority who had lost rights. And, we know that racial discrimination still obviously is very much enforced today, but it's not legally enforced, And also the most painful aspect, on a personal level, friends, colleagues, poetic mentors, all of a sudden persona non grata, and not even willing to really talk about it, which was to me the most shocking and frightening part. One does understand that the friends and colleagues who I'm speaking about are good people and well-intentioned in their actions, which makes the whole thing that much scarier, because principles have been abandoned, thrown overboard, it seems to me, with great haste in these times. And first of all, the principles of liberty and the freedoms that are supposedly guaranteed by the Constitution. Speech, religious worship, assembly, press.
Mm-hmm.
Start with those four. Yeah. The big picture is very interesting to me. One of the most important feature of that big picture is investment in science, or what is called science, as the arbiter of truth. Because it was the authority of science that legitimated the measures, which gave them a veneer of being not motivated by politics or economic motives when they indeed were. And science was abused. Many people still think if you say science, you're speaking about a method of knowledge and processes that guarantee an objective reality. Nothing could be further than the truth. What is done as science, what studies are done, what studies are funded, what articles journals will publish, the review processes, how numbers are interpreted. I mean, from top to bottom, there's ideological, financial, political investment, which doesn't mean to say that there isn't still some genuine science being done, when we owe the challenge to the prevailing story to those scientists or researchers with integrity who have kept at it, and those doctors and those physicians who have bucked the trend. But we live in the modern era. The Constitution was a result in part of the Enlightenment. Reverence for reason and a idea of natural rights and democracy. This was in a movement out of the medieval period when the church was the arbiter of truth. And we all know that that led to, in many ways, tremendous persecution, tremendous violence. At the same time, of course, there were always good priests and those of true faith. But nonetheless, the church as an institution became incredibly powerful in ways that was contrary, certainly, to human freedom. We don't have the church exercising that kind of power anymore. We have science, or technocracy in the reign of science. And you could say that scientism is the new religion of the world, and it's just as corrupt as the Vatican ever was. You know.
Well, what do we do with that? I remember having a pretty extreme despair, in my 20s, that no one could see what was happening.
Yeah.
What is the world in which we live?
Yeah.
That's an echo of something that Martin Luther King Jr. said.
Right.
But then also when I found Rudolf Steiner's work, I'm like, aha, something is moving also science forward.
Yes.
There was this real clear picture given in certain places in Steiner's work that, you realize that we're dancing on the edge of a volcano.
Yeah.
Western civilization.
Yeah. And you say, where do we go with this? I mean, that is a profound question. And I hope that my work, COVID-related work, has a special interest because really my fundamental investment is in the big picture and the underlying historical, philosophical, spiritual currents, and the attempt to see or comprehend the phenomenon in the context of larger historical movements, which you are alluding to. And of course, in retrospect, you say you lived with these kinds of things your whole life, that we can look back and say, oh, when did it happen that the newspaper, there were no longer many independent newspapers, but over time and without anyone paying that much attention to it, all of a sudden, 5 or 6 companies owned all the mainstream newspapers, and all the local journalism and so forth was life support. So these things have been building.
When did that happen?
You tell me. You tell me.
In the 1990s and before, it was Noam Chomsky saying that this consolidation of media is not a good thing.
Yes.
Going a little bit further back with Edward Herman, the manufacturing consent.
Yes.
This critique of how masses are manipulated by, as Chomsky put it, manufacture consent. Like, okay, this is good.
Yes. Yeah.
We'll go along with this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, so let me get back to the other part of your question is, where do we go with this? And I spent 25 years with my primary focus as a scholar on poetry and working on Rilke in connection with serious work with Jung and James Hillman. So a real deep dive into the soul. To do that work, I couldn't have been super involved with politics, because I needed that focus to understand the aspects of the soul that live independently to the extent that they're permitted, that they're privileged to do so, of these world affairs. Now, again, in the larger historical picture, I think crucial to moving in some way forward, in making real progress as humanity, involves something much more fundamental than dealing with matters at the level of, we have to expose that the vaccines aren't safe and effective. We have to expose the corruption of the pharmaceutical influence. All these practical aspects, which are important, but they're manifestations of deeper forces that are insufficiently understood. And we are still living in a world that is divided intellectually between these images of religion and science, right? I mean, much of the socially conservative right is driven, and increasingly so, by a religious agenda, seeing the left as godless, which in many ways it is. But the alternative to that is not theocracy. It's not going back to some pre-modern image of spirituality. This is a place, of course, where Steiner is so important. But of course, the cleft between reason and revelation, science and religion, characterizes what gave rise to our modernity. In the aftermath of the Reformation, you have the trial of Galileo, where the church, in some ways, abdicates its intellectual responsibility for understanding nature. That's handed over to science. So now we have science being the authority on the truth of the creation, and religion being something else, rather than there being any kind of unity of vision in which nature, humankind, and the spiritual or divine world are seen as a unity. We are so fractured in our understanding, in our minds, about what science is, what religion is. And, when religion becomes identified with certain dogmas and science is identified with certain dogmas and certain methods, there's no movement there. There's no possibility of creative synthesis and healing. And the political horror stories that we've seen are in part a function of the abdication of philosophy, of seeing the world whole. Because once you buy into an essentially materialistic view of reality, and that is your ground, then there is no principle other than that of power. And that transmutes to, a wholesale rejection of Western tradition, which can culminate in a surrender of critical thinking and a philosophy, and of having to think things through and believe that there are truths that we can arrive at if we tap into other dimensions of our human being. Again, Steiner is a guidepost there if one understands him. Now, for me personally, and writing The Image to Orpheus, my big Rilke book, and designing and teaching this course, The Poetic Basis of Mind at Pacifica, for a number of years, which is based on that book, that was kind of the culmination of my work on Rilke. He's still very much with me, and that still very much informs how I see things. But then I started working on Emerson, who I'd written my dissertation on Emerson way back when, in the late 80s and 90s. I had been working on Emerson for a few years, for a number of years again, before COVID hit. And it's interesting that Emerson is a scholar, is a thinker, is a writer, is a poet who obviously has a profoundly spiritual grounding. He's a transcendentalist. I mean, every page of his essays drips with the spirit, if we can put it that way. So there's no question of Emerson being unspiritual, of course. But he's not religious. His break from the church as a minister, and how he spoke about that in the Divinity of School address, are landmarks in intellectual history. But where is there cognizant that this happened? We still relate to Christianity for the most part in the mainstream as if Emerson never lived and never raised all the questions about it. The whole Romantic movement, raised about it. There's this whole other stream of modernism which comes through Romanticism, idealism, transcendentalism, a different egress out of the Enlightenment. And Steiner's an extension of that. We didn't take that road. The road we took was the one that capitalized, figuratively and literally, on the materialistic rationality of the Enlightenment. But there's already been profound critiques of that from Romanticism, from Transcendentalism. Emerson and Steiner are both inheritants of that Romantic tradition. And I feel that to go forward, we need to review, recollect, remember the critiques of our mindset, of our frame of mind, of this schism between religion and science, this conception of science, which is Wissenschaft, which means the craft of knowing. It's not just a materialistic, mechanistic process which turns out papers to order and then transmogrifies into technology and AI and transhumanism. That's a caricature of the tradition of the episteme, or the quest for knowledge in the Western tradition. So, there is this transhumanist ideology, dream, which is explicit in the works of people like Kurzweil and many other influential people, that is part of the background of what happened in COVID, part of the background of technocracy. And Steiner would have a lot to say about this in the light of Ahriman and Lucifer and the adversarial forces that are opposing the development of the free human being. So I think, where do we go with this? Well, one thing to do, of course, is to write. One of the beautiful things about writing is one can do it, at least we have sufficient freedom left in this country, that at least at this point I can do it in my own room. I have access to all the rich treasure house of wisdom from the past to try and help me see another way forward, a different way of understanding the foundations of the tremendous antipathies that are ripping the world apart, and the illusions, the ideological illusions upon which those antipathies are based. And there is this kind of collaboration between the Luciferic illusion of what reality is. I mean, we're moving into a realm of replacing nature with this virtual reality, and people dancing around with these headsets or whatever and thinking they're in the world. I don't know. So the Luciferic dreams of attaining spiritualization through technology or intelligence through artificial means, I mean, these are parodies of soul knowledge. These are parodies of wisdom. I mean, I think there's probably very valid uses for AI in certain applications. But if anybody thinks that wisdom, Sophia, can emerge from AI, from computerization, well, that just shows how profoundly we've lost the last shred, a sense of what the human soul and the human spirit is. I'm also a student of esotericism, which you have to be if you study Emerson, because Emerson draws on esoteric sources, as of course does Steiner as well. And they're both involved in the enterprise of drawing upon deep esoteric wisdom and trying to translate it into an idiom that is exoteric, so to speak, that is available to all, and it's not just occult or secret society. That's the essence of transcendentalism for me, is you take the most profound level of thought and you see how it is manifest in the everyday. And Emerson's essays are like that. I mean, he is tapping into very deep metaphysical waters, something like nature or the poet. He's not a systematic philosopher, so he has these glimpses of genius. He has these windows on this deeper metaphysical truths. He can't unfold it systematically. That's one direction to go. And to do it in such a way that doesn't lose, but reveals the mystery, is part of where this project is pointing for me, is to get to those intellectual, spiritual foundations that are the way back to all that's really profoundly wise and precious in the Western tradition, but is also the way forward, because it has to be a new way. The recourse to medieval religion in its orthodox or traditional form is not going to answer the question of the problems of knowledge that science asks. Science has to be once more become Wissenschaft, the craft of knowing, not a technological calculation that ends up in a robotic world ruled by AI. So a rediscovery of the human soul and spirit and its potential is where we have to go. And that's where all the work with Rilke, all the work with archetypal psychology, all the work with Steiner, all the work with John Gebser and so forth, which prepare a reservoir of soul intelligence that one can draw on to try and plot a new path, to wed social criticism with those deeper sources is, I think, the road less traveled by into a more viable, more human future. Because we've been on the edge of that volcano and we're teetering.
Mm-hmm. You've been listening to Aleatory Encounters, a Steiner Books podcast. You can find more about what we do, what you've just heard, and the books we publish at steinerbooks.org.